I'm just going to cover a short soundbite on the main points that we discussed today during the lecture. Now, a supply chain is all about the parties involved in fulfilling a customer request. In this slide, the customer is on the right-hand side of the whole chain. Now, this chain, this very simple chain we've got in front of us, represents all of the parties and organisations that are involved in the manufacture and distribution of a product or services. All the way from the left-hand side, where we may be talking about raw material manufacturers or producers, such as foodstuffs, to manufacturers who make the product, distributors who move the product from manufacturing to us via retailers, and the customers on the right-hand side, the ultimate receivers of the goods or services. Now, a supply chain value we can regard as the difference between what is achieved at the end of the chain from the customer perspective, less all of this effort that is expended in the supplier, the manufacturer and distributor to move the goods and services from left to right. Even for what appears to be very simple products, for example water in the video example we used, nevertheless there has to be people working on moving these goods and services from its original source via any production stages to us as customers. All of this costs time and money and is reflected in the costs which a supply chain absorbs. And this difference between what is actually in the end paid for a good or service, less this cost, is the overall value of the supply chain. Now, an objective, quite simply, of a supply chain can be put in this rather simplistic way, is to have the right products that we need at the right quantities, quite important, particularly for business to business supply chains, and at the right place, meaning the location where it should end up for its final delivery. For example, in Amazon's case, distributing the goods, that would mean to our front door, a more and more important way of delivery. At the right time, I just mentioned here that the right moment is particularly important. Often, particularly in retail chains, suppliers have to deliver their goods within a certain time slot, and if you fall outside of that time slot, then you miss your slot and you have to come back later. And this whole thing, getting this right product at the quantities you want, at the right location, during the right scheduling point, all has to be done by minimizing cost. And to some extent, this is the whole nub of the supply chain problem, how to do all of these things whilst minimizing cost. And we see on the bottom part of this slide some of the issues we will be discussing throughout the course, how we ensure flexibility in terms of the operation, the right products, the right mix of products, and how we organize all that sort of thing. Reliable deliveries, rather obviously, if we have a certain particular time slot that we must hit to deliver our goods, how can we ensure that these are reliable? Think of the supply chain in general. If we have to get goods at a particular moment in time at the end retailer, for example, then going right back through the supply chain, we have to make sure that the distributors get the goods correctly, and so forth. And minimizing costs. Obviously, if we can reduce delivery lead times, this is equivalent to reducing inventory. And inventory carrying and management always involves costs. And supply chain aims to try and minimize or even eliminate the requirement for inventory altogether. A supply chain consists of several interlocking ideas that we will discuss during the course of the entire module. First of all, it involves collaborative relationships across organizations. And very, very quickly, I just want to mention here, collaborative relationship doesn't necessarily mean everybody has to like each other. What it really means is that organizations must work together in order to achieve supply chain objectives. And they actually have very different objectives for the supply chain, as we'll see later on. We need to think about this idea of what do we mean by alignment and integration, and how we can generate seamless flow of goods and services across organizational boundaries. And this is a particularly tricky task that we have to try and manage in the future. There's fragmentation and polarization of supplies. The supply chain is fragmented. If you look at simple things like the pharmaceutical supply chain in China, there are many hundreds of suppliers where we have to try and manage in order to deliver goods and services to end consumers, for example. So how do we manage that? How do we plan across the supply chain? The particular conundrum here is how we can manage across the individual organizations, how we can do end-to-end management of the supply chain. And this obviously is hinting at how can we integrate information systems and flows between organizations using different systems, different protocols and processes within their organizations to manage goods flow. Not an easy task. We'll also discuss a little later on how we can use sourcing, strategic sourcing, particularly outsourcing, to manage the supply chain. Outsourcing is very, very important in the supply chain, particularly in logistics and movements. Think here for a moment of transport and warehousing, which is more and more taken out of a core organization and given to supply chain partners. We can say a supply chain is effective when all of this product information, funds flow and product flow are integrated and coherent, such that we maximize overall value along the chain. But what we're really looking at is value. How revenue is generated from the customer, from selling the goods and services at the end point, less all of the costs that we incur across each step of the supply chain, from manufacturing to storage of the goods and services to the distribution to the end consumer. All of this costs money, and these costs have to be minimized in order to maximize the revenue generated from the customer, given that customer pricing is an important issue and often very difficult to increase. Supply chain from the perspective of distribution. This is what it looks like. In actual practice, most supply chains contain hundreds of suppliers. Think here of the small components and perhaps many factories putting together the product or assemblies, the cartons, the packaging, the individual components. So this is no mean task for us to organize, and we will be discussing some of the trade-offs in particular of how this is done. There are three basic considerations in defining the supply chain. Firstly, how do we design it? What are the basic structures that we need to think about when we're designing a supply chain? What processes are performed where? And at each stage as we go along and between the organizations in the chain. How do we plan a supply chain? Now, the policies and processes of planning guide operations, but unfortunately we're dealing with disparate organizations having their own policies and processes and their own objectives. How do we square this circle? How do we integrate these policies and processes such that we achieve the overall objectives of the supply chain to minimize cost and to maximize revenue? How are they managed? Who manages them? How are policies deployed? Are all things that we will discuss as we go through the particular course. Now, there are some important issues, and we're going to cover all of these as we go through in the different lectures. Integrating the supply chain is a difficult and tricky task. We're trying to do this with different organizations having their own way of thinking and their own shareholders to satisfy and manage. So how do we overcome these barriers to integration? And there are issues, as we all know, we're responding to shorter lead times in products. The faster that we have to deliver a product, the more complicated and the more integration, particularly of IT systems, is required. How do we put these things in place such that we can deliver with ever shorter lead times? How can we eliminate cost? In particular, inventory. Inventory, we need to remove it as much as possible, and if possible, eliminate it altogether. How to move information, and this problem of integration of different organizations. One of the main issues being that even now with major enterprise resource planning systems, organizations have different implementations of them. Data interchange is tricky and difficult and needs proper processes and frameworks in order to agree what information exchange looks like. And the last one I put here is how to respond to fragmentation and the proliferation of stock keeping units. And there are a lot of individual items, slightly different colors, slightly different packaging, slightly different bundles of products. All of these add to the complexity of the supply chain. When we send out a phone to somebody, we need to make sure that it comes with a SIM card or it comes with a headphone set. We have to pull these all together, and they differ compared with the markets we're trying to enter into and the products we are creating. That's it for the first introductory lecture. Next time we'll be looking more at some of the process theories around supply chain management and understanding some of the key terms that we use when describing this important process.